Well, this week we're going to take a look at another kind of government activity that seeks to regulate the behavior of business. But this type of regulation is typically thought of to be more unintrusive and much more beneficial to consumers. It's the idea of, or the topic of antitrust. Many public policies are aimed at limiting or reducing monopoly power. And this is thought to be really good for consumers. Monopolies have higher prices and lower output. Competitive markets have lower prices and higher output. And this leads us to a question of why is monopoly thought of as a bad thing? Now, what's so bad about being a monopolist? Well, we talked a little bit about this already. One of the most common answers is a dead weight loss, the idea that something is lost by someone but gained by no one else. And there's also the idea that under monopoly, there are some customers who want to acquire a resource. They're willing to at least pay the cost of production and maybe even higher, but they don't get served because of the diminished output of the monopolist. There's also the cost of serving, there's also the idea that customers are paying higher prices than they would normally under a competitive market. But according to some research that has been done, monopolies, the cost of monopoly may not be in that dead weight loss. In fact, there have been some studies that looked at the dimensions of the dead weight loss triangle, and it's been found that might actually be just a minuscule percentage of the cost of a monopoly. A greater cost may lie elsewhere. In fact, one of those other costs, a cost that could actually be extraordinarily large, is something called X inefficiency. The term that was sort of coined by an economist named Harvey Liebenstein basically says that X inefficiencies exist when the costs of production are higher than necessary for no real explainable reason. And Liebenstein's research has has convinced him and many others that X inefficiencies are rampant, that they exist everywhere, and they're almost incalculable how large they are. The X inefficiency it doesn't make sense to people who think of firms as profit maximizers. You think, if there's this cost that's higher than necessary, why don't they adjust that cost to be more in line with what everybody else, or the cost of everybody else, and therefore to increase your profits? But it might be simply that a firm can't control costs. They just don't know what those costs entirely are. This is a diagram that sort of illustrates the idea of X inefficiency. What we have here, the curved line, this one I'm highlighting in yellow here, this is called a production function. It simply relates inputs to outputs, and as you increase the number of inputs, you increase your output, but you do so at a diminishing rate, meaning that the additional inputs yield less and less additional output. That's usually the shape of the curve, but notice the dots that are scattered around it. The production function represents sort of an average. Each one of those dots refers to firms and their combinations of inputs and outputs. And in any industry, you tend to have some firms, like firm A, that's an overachiever, that gets more out of their inputs than the average firm. And you also have firms like firm B that seem to not be doing what they could with their inputs. The inputs aren't being used as efficiently as possible. And it would suggest that firm B is just wasting inputs somehow. And that's sort of the idea of X inefficiency. That there's firms that have costs that are higher than necessary and they just don't really know how to control that. Some people say that X inefficiency exists. Others say that it doesn't exist, but in reality, there are certainly firms that don't make the most use out of their resources. So does monopoly promote X inefficiency? Well, some people say yes. Absolutely, because monopolists prefer an easy pace and a quiet life. And so once they become monopolists, they're not going to use their resources as efficiently as possible because that can create conflict within the firm. Others say yes, simply because monopolists have no competitors to keep them honest. Some people say no because the higher costs do actually reduce profits, and monopolists are still profit maximizers, and they're still interested in achieving as high a level of profit as possible. So, does X inefficiency exist? And how extensive is it? Well, a lot of people say it's very, very extensive. And as a result of that extensive X inefficiency, firms are vastly underperforming. Unfortunately, it's hard to measure what isn't there. If you don't know a cost exists, yet it still exists, how do you measure it? Nevertheless, this is a potentially huge cost of a monopoly, just sort of a lazy monopolist swamping the deadweight loss that we've talked about, and something that firms really do need to be consider. Now, another potential cost of monopoly is an idea that's related to some research done by Gordon Tullock and Richard Posner, something called rent seeking, where the profits that you gain from being a monopolist are essentially spent in order to ensure that you maintain your monopoly, not to generate more profit. So maybe you you use your profits to lobby a member of Congress to ensure that they keep out competition from overseas. Nothing you're doing to help your company directly be a better producer. You're just seeking protection. And that can definitely be a source of waste, if you will, a dissipation of the monopoly profit, a cost to society, because you're not making more things, you're just spending it on protecting your position. So in summary, there are definitely costs to being a monopoly. There's the deadweight loss, but those deadweight losses might be kind of small. There are other costs to monopoly, but we don't really know, we don't have good measures of the size. Those things like rent seeking and exit efficiencies, which could be potentially very, very large, but we just haven't come up with a good way of measuring those things yet. So, with that background in place, let's take a look at the issue of antitrust laws. Antitrust laws are laws that are put in place that try to protect competition in the marketplace. The term trust is an old term, really referring to monopoly. So really what we're talking about here is anti-monopoly law. But from the start, it's very clear that there were two dangers, two problems that exist in trying to prevent ganging up on consumers and just simply not acting in an anti-competitive way. The first danger is that the antitrust policy would simply be too weak, so that preventable monopolies would overcharge consumers, possibly indulge in inefficiencies, and they just sort of scoff at the law. The other danger is that the antitrust policies themselves would be far too strong, so that the firms engage in legitimate competition, yet find that their actions get challenged because they did a really good job, serving customers, hurting their rivals, driving people out of business. But they didn't do anything illegal, they just did something really, really well. So we need to keep those two things in mind, and there's certainly a balancing act as we look at antitrust laws, and we want to make sure that we don't do things that are going to discourage productive behavior. So what do the laws say? Well, the oldest antitrust laws are really kind of old. They date back to the era of the robber barons. The original antitrust law is the Sherman Antitrust Act, written back in 1890. And if you just look at the law, it sounds really kind of strong. The first section of the Sherman Antitrust Act says that every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade is illegal. The law applies to interstate commerce or to foreign trade, and if the courts looked at that literally, then most business activity would be illegal because every successful transaction shuts somebody out. When you buy something from Home Depot, you're necessarily not buying it from Lowe's, and that could at least literally be thought of as an antitrust activity or something that sort of some conspiracy against Lowe's. Fortunately, there's quite a significant body of case law that provides guidance about what's legal and what's illegal. The classic Sherman antitrust Section 1 case is a price-fixing conspiracy. So you're trying to get together with your competitors and fix prices so that consumers have to pay artificially high prices. The second section of the Sherman Antitrust Act forbids monopolization. And there's lots of strong language and verbiage there. Under that provision, it's illegal to get a monopoly through merging with rivals or destroying them. And every time that you hear about someone who comes into a market and offers lower prices, that ends up hurting rivals that could eventually be forced out of business. It might be that they're doing something illegal based on the strict interpretation of Section 2. But once again, there's some sort of cooler heads have prevailed when it comes to interpreting the law, and just doing things better and at a lower price than your competitors isn't necessarily illegal. Nevertheless, there were some loopholes that were created in the Sherman Act. So in order to fix those things, Congress developed a couple of other entities and laws to help deal with the implementation of the Antitrust Act. The Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 set up the FTC as a sort of an enforcer of the rules. They have legal power to bring cases and to decide technical questions of business conduct. It looks primarily at competitive behavior and policy dealing with competition, but they also take a look at things like diverse business practices, like such diverse business practices as warranties and deceptive advertising. In 1914, also brought us the Clayton Act, which gave us some more specific kinds of things that are illegal, sort of clarified some of the language of the Sherman Act. 4 particular areas were outlawed in the Clayton Act, including price discrimination, or charging different customers different prices for the same good. Tying of goods, which requires the purchase of one good or service as a condition of purchasing another. And exclusive dealing, which requires a dealer to not carry products from a competing seller. So tying, for example, would be making the purchase of an iPod dependent upon you buying an iMac. You can't buy this iPod unless you buy the iMac. That's tying of goods, and you can't do that. You have to be able to sell them. If the product can be separated, you have to separate them and allow them to be sold separately. There are certain rules written dealing with mergers and acquisitions about how much competition or how much market power you're allowed to create through those 2 things, through mergers and acquisitions. And the prevention of interlocking directories, which basically means that you can't have someone on the board of directors of 2 different companies that do similar things. So Bill Gates can't be on the board of directors of of Microsoft and Apple. The companies are simply too close together and or too much in the same industry, and Gates might have some shall we say, ulterior motives for becoming a board of directors of Apple, and he might do bad things for Apple, or he might create some conflict by getting those two companies to work too closely together. So what are the laws supposed to do? Well, obviously they're supposed to limit monopoly power. They want to ensure competition. They want to make sure that some firm isn't taking over an industry and reducing competition. They want to protect customers. But we do have to pay attention to what's going on there, because in some cases it might be that the laws are trying to keep prices too high. For example, Walmart has been convicted once of pricing pharmaceutical and drugstore items too low, not too high. A court found that Walmart would run some of the independent drugstore rivals out of business. And the fear was that once those competitors were gone, they would raise prices, even though there was no evidence that Walmart had ever done this. And so the court was worried that this was anti-competitive behavior by keeping the prices too low. Competitors were worried that Walmart would continue to price their products low and drive them eventually out of business. So what would have happened if the court conviction of Walmart for pricing too low would have stayed in place? Well, consumers would have had higher prices, of course. The law would have basically mandated that Walmart raise its prices. And this is one of the tensions of the antitrust laws. It's to help consumers, but often in practice, there are small firms that can't compete with low prices, and they want protection at the expense of consumers. So we have to be careful as to how we balance those things out. Now, sort of going forward a little bit, in order to determine when antitrust needs to be put into place or when it needs to be applied, we need to take a look at market power. Market power or market concentration looks at how much of a market a firm controls. And there are a variety of ways of doing this. Interestingly, Karl Marx once said that one capitalist always kills many. And his prediction basically was that capitalism would only become more and more concentrated as time goes on. And so basically the capitalists would eat themselves until there was one surviving, and they would control all of the market. However, that hasn't happened entirely, at least it hasn't happened very quickly. Marx basically predicted that over the course of time that there would just be a reduction in the number of firms, and each firm would have a larger and larger share of the market. Basically, from the early 1930s to the early 2000s, the 200 largest manufacturing firms increased their overall market share from 30 to 40%, which really isn't that big of a deal. But it is a slight increase in market power, and it's something that we do want to pay attention to. Okay, what are we doing here when we measure market power? One, for research purposes, we want to measure the effect of market power on market structure, just to see how the markets are changing. For policy purposes, we want to try to figure out if we can find where any problems might arise. And the public policy question that is of immense concern when dealing with antitrust issues is there a way that we can punish market power and monopoly without punishing success? We don't want to damage the people who are doing things well, who are providing customers with great service and great products, and just drive their competitors out of business because they do a better job. And then we also want to take a look at whether too big to fail, meaning that you're a firm that has too much business, and if you fail, you would cause too much devastation in the economy. Does that lead to increased concentration? So what are the things that we can look at as far as measuring market power? One measure is accounting profit. The rationale behind using profits is really quite simple. Perfectly competitive firms in economic theory don't make high profits over time. In fact, they should earn zero profits. Therefore, if the firm is persistently achieving high profits, it must be doing something wrong. The rationale, however, has some big flaws in it. One of those flaws is that the accounting profit that's reported may be very different from true economic profit for a variety of reasons. More importantly, though, there may be many ways in which firms can make profits over time. Different strategies, improving products, cutting costs, serving customers better. And if we punished firms for making profit, we might be punishing firms who are very successful in what they do. And so if you punish that, you might get less of it. So accounting profit is one way to measure concentration, but it's maybe not the best way. Another way is to use something called the Lerner Index. The Lerner Index basically suggests that the big problem with monopoly is that price exceeds marginal cost. And so we have this monopoly markup over price. To standardize the measure of price over cost, we use this letter M here. So this is just, the M just stands for markup, and we take the price minus the marginal cost divided by price to get an idea as to how much deadweight loss is created in the monopoly process of marking up over cost. And it's a pretty appealing tool with a pretty good sound theoretical background, but it's relatively difficult to calculate in practice. Most accounting systems are based on total cost and average, not on margins. Marginal cost has to be derived from pretty complicated economic calculations. And even price isn't so easy to find on some industries because transactions rarely take place at the posted or list price. You try to get price data on cars or houses, and it's hard to get because, what's the actual price of the product being sold? So we've got this difficulty in calculating marginal cost. Some people have recommended using average variable cost, but that ignores capital and research and development and advertising costs. So while the Lerner Index has some appeal, it's not the best option either. Only if you have identical products with identical costs, then maybe you have something to work with. But other than that, you're sort of stuck, which leads us to another measure of market power. This is known as the concentration ratio. The concentration ratio looks at the percentage of an industry sales accounted for by the top N number of firms, most commonly 4, but also there's data for 8 and data for the 20 top firms, calculated by the government, and it's a measure of market power. We figure if firms control most of the market, then they can gang up on customers and charge higher prices. And so we just want to see how much of the firm is controlled by a particular number of firms. And that does give us some idea about how concentrated an industry is. And this data, if you Google concentration ratios, you can find the data as it's been calculated. But sort of the preeminent measure of market power and market share is something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. This is an index that takes a look at the sum of all the firm's market shares, and then you square those shares. So, for example, if you have a small number of firms, let's say just 3 firms, one firm has 60% of the market, one has 30% of the market, one has 10% of the market. You take each one of those shares of the market, you square that number, and you add them up, and you get 4,600, and that is the Herfindahl Index. So there we go. Mathematically, the highest that can be, of course, is 10,000. Because if you have one firm that's got 100% of the market and you square that, you would have 10,000 as your Herfindahl Index. As more firms enter the market, the Herfindahl Index naturally drops, and that creates more competition in the market. However, if you have firms, like dominant firms who have big shares of the market, that may actually cause the Herfindahl index to rise. As you're squaring that number, it's making it more important. So basically, this number can be this number is an indicator of market strength, market concentration, but it's also used when mergers and acquisitions are being evaluated. Any merger that raises the index by more than 100 points is subject to special scrutiny by the Justice Department. It doesn't indicate misconduct, but it just is a sort of a red flag that this might be increasing concentration more than we would like it to be. Sort of increased. Again, so the Herfindahl index drops as the number of firm increases, but as the inequality of the market shares increases, the Herfindahl number goes up. So let's take a look here at a quick question about how to calculate the Herfindahl index. If there are 10 firms with an equal share in the market, what will the Hirschman index be? Is it 20? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Or is it 2,000? So remember how you calculate the Herfindahl index. You take the market share of each firm and you square it, and then you add them all up. So here's how you arrive at the correct answer of 1,000. Each firm, there are 10 firms. Each firm has 10% of the market to give us 100%. If you square 10, that gives you 100. Take each firm, each one of the 10 firms has 100 as their little Herfindahl index for each firm, I suppose, and you add all that up and you get 1,000. So the correct answer there would be 1,000. Now, all concentration measures are based on a government standard, and those markets are subject to the way governments decide to sort of define the industry. Currently, we define industries in North America by the North American Industry Classification System, or the NAICS. Now, the NAICS is a series of what are called nested codes, where the codes get longer and longer as you go deeper into an industry. So, for example, Code 311 is food manufacturing. Code 3113 is sugar and confectionery product manufacturing. 31132 is chocolate and confectionery product manufacturing from cacao beans, whereas 31133 is confectionery manufacturing from purchased chocolate. So these are different codes, different categories in which firms can fall, and there are some problems here. Where are we going? What's the relevant market? Should a firm be sort of fall under just food manufacturing, or should it be under confectionery manufacturing from purchased chocolate? Identifying which industry a firm falls into is a really important part of determining whether or not a merger can be allowed or should be allowed. One of the problems is that the classes can easily be too small. 336111 are passenger cars, but that omits foreign competition and therefore shows the market dominance by the largest firms as being extraordinary. So the 8-firm concentration ratio in North America is 97.5%, but that excludes all foreign manufacturers. And so that is a problem with the codes. The classes could also be too large. For example, cement and concrete NAICS is 3273, and it has a national concentration of 8.3%. And that looks like, wow, that must be really competitive. But cement and concrete are sold in local markets, and they're often dominated by a small number of firms. And so while at the North American level, it doesn't look like there's a lot of concentration because of shipping costs, there can actually be quite a bit of concentration in your local market. And that leads us to something, sort of an interesting development in the idea or in the analysis of concentration. Bank concentration is of significant interest to economists these days. In 2007, when the economic crisis hit, the top 5 U.S. banks held 11.8% of assets. After the crisis started to clear up in 2010, the top 5 banks increased their share to 13.3% of assets. The banks are Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs. So as banks were going bankrupt, those assets were being acquired by bigger banks, and now we have more concentration in the industry. Well, that led to some consternation. And so in the Financial Reform Bill of 2010, or more commonly known as the Dodd-Frank Act, it set a 10% market share limit on financial firms and acquisitions. So this is intended to promote stability, and it's intended to help keep firms from becoming too big to fail. If you're a big company, if you're Citibank and you own a significant portion of the financial assets of the economy, and you run into some financial difficulties, and you are worried that you might go out of business, this could cause significant panic in the market. And it might also invite the government to come in and bail you out because you are too big to fail. If you fail, who knows who's coming, who's going to also fail? Who knows what the, sort of where the connections are that are going to pull other companies down and so to prevent that from happening, to prevent those connections and that too big to fail mentality from sort of creeping in, the Dodd-Frank bill said this 10% market share on financial firms. Now, whether it works or not, we'll just have to wait for the next financial crisis. But it is an idea, it is an interesting provision to try to limit the market power of certain firms. Now, there is one downside of antitrust law that we want to consider here. Not the only downside, but is a concern, and that is whether or not we want to prevent monopolies in the first place. As our economy becomes more technologically savvy, as it becomes more information dependent, for some products and services, there is certainly a value to the customer that's generated by how many people use the product. Obviously, Microsoft Windows and Microsoft Office and Word and Excel and PowerPoint, the more people who use those, the more valuable they become, because as you move from one computer to another, the more likely it is that you're going to find that software on another computer. That product becomes more valuable as more other people use it, and it is said to exhibit demand-side economies of scale. Markets that have demand-side economies of scale or network effects are sometimes said to be tipping markets, where there's positive feedback that makes the strong get stronger and the weak get weaker. It might pay you to establish a standard, even if you have to give it away. So what do I mean by all this? Well, the market for, say, Blu-ray players, there was a battle going on between HD DVDs and Blu-ray. And who was going to establish the standard type of machine to play those discs? Well, the battle was fought and won by Blu-ray, which basically meant that HD DVDs were now going to be essentially worthless because you weren't going to be able to buy a HD DVD player. The market said, we want Blu-ray available everywhere so that you can take your Blu-ray discs and go from your house to your friend's house to your cousin's house, and you can play that disc anywhere you go. and your grandma's not going to get confused as to whether to buy you an HD DVD or a Blu-ray at Christmas time. The market tipped in favor of HD DVD or in favor of Blu-ray, and when that happens, it can almost ensure a technology achieves a certain degree of monopoly power, and that may not be a bad thing. The standardization of certain products and the standardization of certain technologies allow consumers to be able to move somewhat seamlessly from one location to another. The key idea here with network effects would be that the demand-side economies of scale are valuable. They create value, and the network value increases just because more people are using the product. Those are sometimes called network externalities. There can be path dependency, so that small changes can cause major changes over time. This deals with a concept called Metcalfe's law, where the value of the network increases at approximately the rate at which the square of the number of computers connected to the network increases. Sort of a physics term there, but a physics concept there. But as more people use the network, as more people become connected to the network, it becomes much more valuable. So in the early days of cell phones, you wanted everybody on the same network you were because it became more valuable. You had friends on AT&T and friends on Verizon and friends on Sprint. You couldn't call each other. The question is, okay, well, how valuable is that cell phone if you can't call each other? Now that's not as big a deal, but the networks would become more valuable as more people were using it. So how does antitrust work in practice? Well, an antitrust case can begin in one of two ways. The government observes some actual or potential violation, and they can, working through either the Justice Department or the Federal Trade Commission, take action against who they think is the perpetrator. The second way that this can begin is if a private firm brings a complaint against a competitor for wrongdoing. At that point, court action is initiated by the filing of a complaint. Particularly in the case of government, there may be a long period of evidence gathering, a review before the complaint is considered. The government may propose a settlement, which would preclude the need for a costly court action. And oftentimes when settlements are reached, the company pays a fine. They say, we didn't really do anything wrong, but they pay the fine anyway. The reason they pay the fine is that antitrust action, when it starts to proceed beyond the complaint stage, can quickly become very, very costly to the parties involved. They're complex. They tend to have large expenditures of time and money and depositions, pretrial testimony, high costs, expert witnesses, and firms would typically like to avoid these costs if at all possible. Trials can get extraordinarily costly, and it's really difficult to know how much antitrust action is undertaken purely for strategic reasons. So when there's no genuine inquiry to competition, but someone alleges a violation anyway, it becomes just a very difficult thing to sort of settle on. And then if you are found in violation of the antitrust laws, the rules call for a tripling of damages, once you go through all of the court costs, if you are found guilty, you could have to pay a substantial fee. So antitrust court cases themselves are fairly rare because of the costs involved. Anyway, that's sort of an introduction, if you will, into antitrust. Antitrust can be an extraordinarily in-depth area of study. People go to law school to become antitrust lawyers and spend lots of hours learning about the ins and outs of antitrust law. But this gives us an idea as to things that governments do to try to maintain competition in the market, and thereby interfering with the activities and the behaviors of business.